Good morning, everyone. This is Commissioner French. I'm joined by Commissioner Keene, staff of the Kansas Corporation Commission, representatives from CURB, and representatives from the Midwest Reliability Organization. We are convening our second in a series of 3 work studies on resource adequacy issues. And as I said, for this one, we're joined by the Midwest Reliability Organization. At this point, I'll turn it over to Jeff McClanahan, Director of the KCC's Utilities Division, for some brief opening remarks and to introduce our speakers. Jeff?
Good morning, Commissioners, and thank you for taking the time to have yet another work study with us. I want to introduce first members of staff that will be participating today. That would be Justin Grady, our Chief of Revenue Requirements, Class Cost of Service, and Finance, as well as Leo Hanos, our Chief Engineer, who is Chief of our Energy Operations and Pipeline Safety. Also want to introduce members of CURB. I'm not sure if I see David Nichols on, so Todd, do you want to make introductions of
Yes,
staff?
that'd be fine. This is Todd Love. I'm one of the attorneys with CURB. Joseph Pacegrab is on the line as well. I'm not sure about Josh France or Patrick Orr. David will not be able to attend.
Todd, I am online on mute. I'll be on mute.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Josh France, analyst with CURB. I'm also online.
Great, thanks guys, and welcome. With that, let me introduce Midwest Reliability Organization. They will go over their various roles, but of particular interest to us is their responsibility to protect the reliability and security of the North American bulk system in a region that spans 2 Canadian provinces and 16 states, which includes the SPP footprint, which we operate in. As part of this responsibility, Midwest, or MRO, I think is the acronym that they use, publishes regional risk assessment annually to inform key decision makers of the greatest risks to the reliability and security of the regional power grid. So obviously with resource adequacy, this is of keen interest to us. And with that, I will turn it over to Tasha Ward, who is MRO's Director of Enforcement and External Affairs, to introduce MRO staff. Thank you, Tasha.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, commissioners and members of CURB for having us today for this education section. If we go ahead and start the slides, I do have introductions in the slides, and I think I was going to share. There we go. Just to test, can you see the slides?
We can.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So once again, good morning, everyone. My name is Tasha Ward. I'm the Director of Enforcement and External Affairs here at MRO. And I'm joined today by Brian Clark and Mark Tiemeyer. And in our slide packet, we do have an introduction slide so you can get a little bit about our background. So I've been with MRO since October 2019. However, I've been in the Electric Reliability Organization, or in this regulatory construct, since 2009. I've been in the industry almost 14 years now, and before joining MRO, I was at Southwest Power Pool in the regional entity. And then when the regional entity dissolved, I was actually in the SPP compliance department for a little over a year. I'm joined today by Brian Clark. He is our Director of Reliability Analysis. Brian, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry about the delay.
It's okay.
I guess that will require me to turn on my video and unmute. Sure, Brian Clark, as Tasha said, Director of Reliability Analysis at MRO. Been with MRO since 2018, and previously also with Southwest Power Pool, a different area than Tasha. I never actually worked with her. I was transmission planning for 2 of those 8 years, and then the other 6 years I was in the operations, specifically day-ahead market operations. So excited to be here today to explain a little bit more about MRO and the role we play in reliability. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Mark?
Yeah, I had to delay to get my video started. Thanks, Tasha. So Mark T. Meyer, I'm MRO's Principal Technical Advisor. I've actually newly joined the MRO back in July of last year. So I've only been on in the company for about 6 months now. But previous to that, I've had extensive experience in industry, working for 15 years at Excel Energy in their transmission system operations department. I actually led their real-time operators that are responsible for the reliability of Excel's northern system, which is mainly in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. But previous to that, I also did have electrical engineering roles within Excel and at Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, again, focused on transmission system operations.
Thank you, Mark. So with that, we will get started. So today we have 3 different buckets of information that we're going to share with you. First, I'm going to kick off and give you a little bit of background of who MRO is and what we do on a higher level. And then I'm going to hand it off to Brian, and he is going to get into the details around our reliability analysis department and the seasonal assessments that they perform. And then we will end the session with Mark discussing the MRO regional risk assessment, which was just published late Monday afternoon. So this is kind of a first look into that regional risk assessment. And of course, we are happy to take any questions. If it's easier to do it as we want to proceed, that's great. If you want to wait till the end, we will also take a pause in between the 3 different areas to see if there are any questions. So with that, I will get started. So on our first slide here, and I'm going to decrease that so we can see it better. Thank you. Okay. So on our first slide here, this is just a little bit about MRO and our company profile. If you look at the map here in the blue shaded areas, that is our footprint. And we have all or part of 16 states, and then also the 2 Canadian provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. We are headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the regional footprint includes more than 220 registered entities. And our registered entity count, it fluctuates and can change depending on if, there's a new asset being added and they need to register, for example, a new wind farm. And then also there's a deregistration process as well, and that's under Brian's department. A little bit about our history, like why are we here and how did we get here? So in 2007, there was the start of the mandatory reliability standards. And this is under a larger web of the NERC, or North American Electric Reliability Corporation's rules of procedure. And there is a regulatory construct where these 6 regional entities do have delegation agreements with NERC. And then also our work goes to FERC for US entities, and then the provinces to those provincial regulators. So this slide just shows kind of our incremental steps on how this program has grown since the standards became mandatory and enforceable in 2007. We started with a 0 tolerance construct. However, over the years, we are shifted to a risk-based construct, which is important so the more serious risk issues are addressed timely manner, and then also it level sets with minimal risk issues and serious risk issues. In 2018, MRO doubled their size with the dissolution of the SPP-RE, and we enhanced different internal programs. And then in 2020, we continued to grow into our new company with additional registered entities, and improve our stakeholder engagements with the advisory councils and then other forums such as the Security Forum and Standards Forum. And I'll talk more about the advisory councils here in a moment. So our vision, go back here real quick. One thing I do want to say here, you see there's the small piece of, or the middle piece of who MRO is. But of course, as you all know, there is the rest of the country and other Canadian provinces. So we are one of 5 other regions that are part of the Electric Reliability Organization, and they are headquartered in various parts of the U.S. There is WEC, the Western Electric Coordination Council, that is in the Salt Lake City area, Reliability First, which is in Cleveland, CERC Reliability Corporation in Charlotte, and then NPCC, which is headquartered in New York, and then Texas RE, which has that piece of Texas that you see there in the gray. So we are one of 5 other regions that are promoting the reliability and security of the bulk power system, along with NERC, FERC, and the provincial regulators.
Tasha, if I could ask a quick question here.
Sure.
On your footprint, I know you probably get this one all the time, but it's not totally clear to me. If you could just, I see there's a lot of overlap, but not exact with the SPP footprint. Could you just kind of go through where there is overlap in responsibilities with SPP or other RTOs, or what are the unique roles that the regional entities like MRO provide that RTOs do not provide? And if you've got a slide on it later or plan to talk about it later, I'm happy to have you defer to later, but I wanted to make sure we get that clarified.
So I do go into different regulatory functions that MRO does, but primarily the main difference between the RTOs and MRO as a regional entity is we actually are the regulator, and we regulate the RTOs into their compliance around these mandatory reliability, NERC reliability standards. So some of that is through a joint format, like I know SPP is expanded into the West. So they're also a registered entity in the WEC region. So both WEC and MRO are the regulators for SPP. MISO, that's also another joint registered entity that's in MRO, CERC, and Reliability First. Brian, keep me honest if I misspoke there. But the main difference with that is that we're the regulator, and then we're here just to provide, education on our public reports. We're in no means any type, to opine on anything in any type of lobbying construct. So that is the main difference between the RTOs and MRO.
So would I be correct to think about it, like FERC has delegated some authority to the RTOs in the planning areas? Would I be correct to think that FERC and NERC have delegated some compliance and regulatory authority to the regional organizations like MRO?
Yes, that is correct. That is, we have delegation agreements that are on our websites with NERC that are approved by FERC. So yes, that is correct, Commissioner French.
Tasha, real quick, because there's other regions and you're all reporting up to NERC, am I correct in assuming that your methodologies when you do your reliability assessments are similar across the regions, so that we're not comparing apples to oranges, so to speak, between one region and another when we look at different organizations doing the reliability assessments?
Jeff, that's a good question. Brian, I'm going to let you speak to that since you are the head of reliability analysis.
Yeah, very good question, Jeff. And my answer would be the best that we can. You have to take into consideration the reason that we're split up into regions like we are is because things are different from assessment area to assessment area. You look at MRO, we're made up of, where we have enforcement authority over 2 RTOs. And 2 of those RTOs are also reliability coordinators, and please forgive me if I'm throwing out terms you guys aren't familiar with. But then you look at WEC, they are a regional entity that takes care of one entire interconnect. You look at the Eastern Interconnect, we're split up between MRO, RF, MPCC, and also CERT. So things look different from region to region and interconnect to interconnect. But we do our best to be consistent in terms of assessments, specifically around resource adequacy. And I'll get into more of that later in the presentation.
Okay. That answers my question. Thank you.
Tasha Dwight Keene, if I could ask her a question. How is the MRO funded?
We are funded through assessments from load serving entities.
Okay. That's throughout the entire 16 states and the scope of your footprint then?
Yes, within our scope of our.
I'm sorry, all load serving entities?
Yes.
Okay. And I think you'll get into this later, but we're talking about, I'm trying to get my mind around the scope of your regulation. You have enforcement authority, and as I understand it, you're regulating RTOs for compliance with NERC reliability standards. That's a pretty good sized mission. Is that a succinct statement of your mission, or are there other attributes to it that go beyond that?
There are other attributes that go beyond, and part of those attributes are what we're discussing today with our reliability assessments. That's a different division. That's not in the regulatory department. There is the Compliance Monitoring and Enforcement Program, which is an appendix to the NERC Rules of Procedure. And that particular document is what is the governance for compliance, risk assessment and mitigation, and the enforcement leg of it. There's also in the Rules of Procedure about the reliability assessments portion of it, which is Brian's department, and Mark with the regional risk assessment and how we're looking forward. Those departments do not regulate or do not, assess issues of non-compliance through the Compliance Monitoring Enforcement Program. They're part of the bigger umbrella of the Rules of Procedure.
Okay, then my 160,000 foot question is, to whom do you report? Not you personally, but to whom does MRO report?
So MRO we do have a 23-member board of directors that has a combination of stakeholders and independent board members. And then our delegation agreement is with NERC. And so our work goes to NERC, and then NERC in turn connects with FERC. And that's on the US entities. Now for the provinces, we inform NERC and we work with the provincial governments.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you all for the questions. Really appreciated. So now I'm going to get into MRO's vision, which is consistent with the ERO. So our vision, of course, is to have a highly reliable and secure North American bulk power system. And we take what it means to be reliable is that there are no weak links. We are in the business of trying to prevent or trying to find any potential errors and prevent any uncontrolled cascading events. So at MRO, we promote this by highly effective reliability organizations, or what we call heroes. And so this is our vision. We identify, prioritize, and assure effective and efficient mitigation of risk to the reliability and security of the bulk power system by promoting these heroes, which are these highly effective reliability organizations. And how do we do that? So on this slide, we have the key characteristics of heroes. And as you see, there are 5 different areas, and they're all in a large circle because they all interconnect. So our hero registered entities, they have a preoccupation with failures, and that means they are looking at their programs and paying attention to any close calls or near misses and seeing how they can strengthen their internal compliance programs around the reliability and security of not only their company, but the bulk power system. Heroes also have a reluctance just to simplify or band-aid a situation. They perform solid root cause analysis of any potential issues. They have carefully designed change management practices. Once again, that goes into being more detailed and more intentional about their internal compliance programs and their internal controls around the reliability standards. There's a deference to expertise, which, there's so many smart people in this industry. So you follow the expertise, you follow the guidance of what's available, and then the commitment to resilience. So that's the corrective action plans and training and the prevention of any recurrence or detective controls to even prevent an issue from occurring. So this is MRO's model of what a key characteristic of a highly effective reliability organization is.
Tasha, this is Leo Hanos. I have a question. I'm an engineering staff here at the commission. So do you rate the attributes of your various utilities as far as how they fit into the hero spectrum, as far as beginner hero or fully attained hero?
No, I would not say like we had a list. These are just things that we look for in our registered entities to be considered or to be a hero, but we don't have like a list that say these entities are heroes.
There's really no evaluation of each one of these 5 attributes as to how they fit.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. So there is these, like when they are going through any type of compliance engagement, our compliance team looks into these different attributes, and then as they go through the CMEP process, yes, we do look at these attributes as we're going throughout these processes to see how the entity fits into this hero construct. I'm sorry, I misunderstood your first question.
Thank you.
So this is our risk-based. Oh, I'm sorry,
Could I
Brian.
add to that? I just
Yes.
want to make sure. And I would also add that it's really more about behaviors and promoting a culture. Leo, absolutely, we're taking these things into consideration when we perform these compliance engagements. But this is something that we promote in all areas of MRO, not just concerning compliance responsibilities. We want entities to exhibit these behaviors and to follow the high reliability organization principles.
Thank you, Brian. That's an excellent point that we do look at that throughout the organization. On this slide, so this is supporting the work of heroes, and this is our risk-based regulatory approach, which has these 3 areas. There's the intelligence-led, the risk-based, and the adaptive. So starting with the intelligence-led column, this involves really what we are discussing today, the operational information and emerging issues. This includes, a group study of the bulk power system events, which both Brian and Mark are a piece of. And then for us to be, committed to be up to date and identify emerging issues, not only within the region, but across the ERO, and sharing our understanding of these issues of the risk to the industry and with the industry. And we do this, as I said, with documents we're discussing today, such as the regional risk assessment, our seasonal assessments. NERC has the long-term reliability assessment and other studies that are published publicly to show emerging issues, analysis of system events. Then the next column is our commitment to being risk-based. This goes more into the regulatory functions of the registered entities. So there are the mandatory reliability standards. We perform, risk assessments. There's an inherent risk assessment. There is, if there is an issue of noncompliance, the risk assessment that our risk assessment mitigation team performs. And then also we look at alerts and other tools, and the alerts is another piece that is in Brian's reliability analysis department. The third column we have is just being adaptive, having proportional responses to industry behaviors and regulatory responses. When the mandatory standards first started, there was not this construct of more risk-based and actually assessing the issue depending on the risk to the reliability of the bulk power system. So this is how we support the work of HEROES with these 3 different buckets, and how our work leans into that to help promote the reliability and security of the bulk power system. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about MRO's organizational groups. And these are 3 different councils that we have in addition to our board of directors. So we really like to leverage our members' expertise and experience on these organizational groups. So these organizational groups are made of stakeholders. And we have the CMEP, or Compliance Monitoring Enforcement Advisory Council, the Reliability Advisory Council, and then our Security Advisory Council. And under these 3 advisory councils in our region, we do have several subgroups. There's a security threat call subgroup, there's a standards forum under the CMEPAC, a protective relay subgroup under the Reliability Advisory Council. So with these organizational groups, we are really taking expertise and experience from our stakeholders to be more informed of the risk and issues throughout our footprint. So the CMEP, or Compliance Monitoring Enforcement Program Advisory Council, for their different activities, they work to integrate that HEROES mission and the principles to support MRO. They have an annual conference that is held usually in the summertime to share, lessons learned or risks that they see throughout the footprint and ERO. It is a forum for registered entities to discuss newer revised NERC reliability standards, and that's that NSRF that I mentioned briefly earlier. There's industry guidance that through standard application guides that this council does. Internal control programs guidance, and they really foster that sense of networking and leaning into other registered entity peers. I'm sorry. Yes.
Pardon my interruption. This is Dwight Keene again. If I could ask another question here, because you're going to some level of detail. I appreciate that. I'm a very granular person myself, but I'm trying to maintain a context of the overall while you do this. So I guess my question would be, and I'm sorry for my interruption, I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought here at all, but given the MRO's charge and its footprint, I guess I'm wondering what enforcement and regulation of RTO performance is left for the RTO itself to perform. I'm asking that because it strikes me that I'm wondering, do some of these councils not duplicate the internal operations and groups that are within SPP itself, and aren't they somewhat comparable and duplicative? Thank you.
Thank you. And that is a good point. I think some of the work could potentially be duplicative. I didn't realize that, the RTOs have their own subgroups as well, but they generally function on that RTO's footprint, where these councils, they're looking at MRO's footprint as a whole. And that includes, non-RTO registered entities. Brian, did you have anything to add to that? I was about to go to your councils.
I think you knew I would. So I would say that great question, Commissioner, and there is potential for that. We make sure we're kind of plugged into, a lot of the work that the RTOs are doing so that we can prevent that. But also you have to keep in mind, so the RTOs are more member driven. We're more objective. So we have registered entities in our footprint, but it's not our responsibility to satisfy them. We're there to enforce reliability standards and make sure we have bulk electric system or bulk power system reliability. So the mission and the focus is slightly different. Obviously, we're all in the business of keeping the lights on. It's just that we're not driven to, I guess, satisfy the members, if that makes sense.
I'm sorry, Brian, you're not driven to what? I'm sorry, I missed the last part of your statement.
To satisfy our members.
Oh,
We're not an organization created to satisfy our members.
okay. Well, I would certainly hope that the SPP would be equally concerned about not only the welfare of their members, but the welfare of the ratepayers.
Absolutely. Yeah,
that we're all
I'm not
concerned about.
I'm not implying they don't care.
I'm not suggesting. I'm
Yeah,
not suggesting. I'm not suggesting that. I'm only suggesting that I'm just trying to see where because ratepayers are going to ultimately pay for both the operations of MRO and SPP, are they not?
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to discern where there is a kind of a distinction with a difference here, if you would, where there is a differentiation between the functions you're performing and those that are being performed by the SPP. And I appreciate your indulgence of my question.
Yeah, and I'll stand by. It's a very good question, and you know, coming from where you are, I understand the question. We're not operating the system. You know, we're not monitoring the system like SPP or the other RTOs are. So there's also another difference. You know, we once again, all of us are, I believe, are in the business to make sure that people have electricity. It's just a different perspective in terms of, you know, membership in an RTO is a choice. To be a registered entity under reliability standard enforcement is not a choice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So to continue, another council is the Reliability Advisory Council, and that is under Brian's department's construct of reliability analysis. And they do work closely, as he said earlier, with the regional planning coordinators to understand the resource mix. And he'll go more into detail around this in his slides shortly. And then there's the Security Advisory Council and our Director of Security, Steen Fjallstead. This is the council that he is the liaison for. And the Security Advisory Council promotes the security pieces. So they look at the EMS, the SCADA systems, look at regional security risk, and they work with different entities such as the EISAC and the DHS, the FBI. They're on security threat calls. They really stay plugged into any security issues that can be a threat to the bulk power system. And so with that, I am going to hand off to Brian unless there are any additional questions for me. Okay, great. Brian.
Thank you very much, Tasha, and you can go to the next slide. I'll say this the same way that Tasha's presentation went. You know, as you have questions, feel free to interject. I'll do my best to avoid acronyms and or you know, terms that might not be familiar to you. But if I happen to throw some of those out there, question me. I'll explain myself. And you know, the super technical questions, once again, I'll do my best. If it's really hard, I'll probably pass it to Mark T. Meyer. But let's get started. So the reliability analysis department, which, you know, we talked about this at the beginning, but separate from any compliance or enforcement activities. Obviously, we're one organization, so you know, we're here to help the compliance department and the enforcement department but we don't participate in audits. What do? We perform reliability assessments. We are involved with bulk power situational awareness, which is mainly, communication with the reliability coordinators and transmission operators that are operating the system during extreme weather events. Say, you get one of these winter storms that come through, we receive updates from them and pass that information back to NERC real time. Event analysis can also be described as root cause analysis, as outages or disturbances on the grid occur. If it's of significance, we will look into that, and a team here at MRO will perform a root cause analysis, work with registered entities to develop any lessons learned or meaningful information that can be passed to other entities in the region or even outside the region. Performance analysis, that's more collecting a lot of data quarterly, mainly around generation availability, transmission availability, and misoperations. And then the last one is less of an analysis task and more of a foundational task, I would say, with entity registration and certification. Just making sure that all the registered entities are on the registry as they should be for the appropriate functions. So we talked about the RTOs, the SPPs, the MISOs. They're on the registry as reliability coordinators, balancing authorities, but you have other entities that are on the registry for functions such as transmission owner, transmission operator, generator owner, generator operator. These functions determine the standards that apply to the entity based on their responsibilities.
And this is Leo again. I have a question on the bulk power situational analysis. We have a lot of, generator tie lines in Kansas connecting various wind farms to the system. Does your analysis extend into those generator tie lines as far as situational analysis, or are they considered part of the bulk power supply by you guys?
I'm assuming this voltage is above 100 kV, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it would, Leo, but we typically don't dip into that unless there's a problem because it's more of a real-time responsibility. We focus more on after the fact analysis. If the real-time issue rises to the level of, hey, we need to be involved, or NERC is asking us questions, then we would reach out to entities in our footprint. Another good example was the derecho storm that rolled through a few years ago that impacted Iowa heavily. We were in close contact with a lot of the entities that felt the impacts of that and passed that information along to NERC. So I would say bulk power situational awareness is not something that we are involved with day to day. We do receive reports from some of the RTOs, both of the RTOs in our region and one of the larger reliability coordinators, just to get a sense of these are the outages on our system today. This is the weather forecast. This is the peak demand forecast, those type of things. But we don't really get involved unless there's a serious issue. Does that answer your question, Leo?
Yeah, I think so. On the performance side of that, would you be looking at, I'm guessing like transmission availability data, TADS and GADS reports from NERC? You
Exactly
analyze
right.
that for trends?
Yes.
Are those trends published anywhere? Like if we wanted to see the TADS data for Kansas, for example, could we get that from you guys or from NERC?
So it's not publicly available in the sense of here's all the TADS data from entities in Kansas. We do compile it and we provide that information in our seasonal assessment, the internal seasonal assessment, which I'll be covering later in this presentation. So the links to all of these assessments that we'll go over today are actually in the presentation. So you can see some of that GADS, TADS, and MIDAS information in that regional winter assessment. One more thing I wanted to add, and you can stay on the slide, Tasha, is fine, is, you talked about what we do is reliability analysis. I thought it'd be good to explain a little bit about the department and the size of the department. So we are made up of about 8 engineers that have experience in power system operations, system protection, transmission planning. So these individuals have spent time at most of them at registered entities doing a lot of this work. So it's not foreign to them. I'm proud of the team we have. We have a lot of knowledge, a lot of good, strong knowledge on the team, and they work well with registered entities in our footprint. So all this slide is more of a, I guess, just a diagram to kind of illustrate the relationship between the 4 functions that I covered on the previous slide. Today will be more about the reliability assessments, and you can see it is a future look at things. I would not call it a prediction. It is more of a projection based on the information provided to us by the assessment areas. You can go to the next slide. So reliability assessments are one of the tools that we as the ERO enterprise have to identify and quantify emerging reliability issues. This allows ERO enterprise, and when I say ERO enterprise, I'm talking NERC in the 6 regions. I'm not sure if Tasha covered that, so I apologize for throwing it out without explaining. And the purpose of these assessments is really to provide risk-informed recommendations and support a learning environment for industry to pursue improved reliability performance. We're getting a lot of good use out of our assessments as of lately. We've been doing them for a very long time, but there's more interest in them, I would say, in the past 2 or 3 years. And they're great for talking points for during meetings like this with state regulators or other organizations outside the ERO enterprise. This also fulfills a responsibility that we have under the NERC rules of procedure to publish assessments annually. And we don't do this in a bubble. We've got the Reliability Assessment Subcommittee, which is a NERC stakeholder committee that has participation obviously from NERCs, so NERC committee, the people from the 6 regions, and also registered entities, more specifically the assessment areas. They have representation on this subcommittee, and they meet throughout the year to develop the report and talk through the data that they submit for the report. Annually, we publish 3. They got the winter reliability assessment, the summer reliability assessment, and the long-term reliability assessment. The winter is normally published in the November timeframe, the summer assessment around May, and then the long-term reliability assessment is December. Next slide. So in addition to those 3 assessments that we work with NERC to publish, MRO also publishes 2 internal assessments. And this is more of an emphasis on the MRO region itself, not continent-wide. We do a regional winter and a regional summer, and it has more information than just the seasonal outlook. As I mentioned earlier, when Leo asked the question, we include significant disturbances or events and kind of talk through what was lost, what happened, why it happened. A good example would be a fault occurred, protection system misoperation, loss of this many megawatts of load, loss of this many transmission elements, and maybe loss of a generator of this size. And then we'll explain what the entity did in terms of a corrective action. We don't publish like the actual entity that experienced the event. We keep that anonymous. I see a camera on, so I believe there's a question.
Yeah, very quick one. You halfway covered it, Brian. You anticipated my question probably inadvertently, but yeah, I was wondering about the availability or accessibility of these reports to the state or to the public?
Yeah, so you can read through the events in our assessment, and like I said, the link is at the end of this report, I believe, this presentation, the last slide. It also kind of depends, Commissioner, on the comfort level of the entity. There have been some events that resulted in a lessons learned publication, and sometimes the entities, they're not afraid of revealing that, hey, this was us, and you can publish that in a report, and we don't really care, or we'll come and talk about it. It's more about getting entities comfortable with sharing that information and understanding that it's really to promote reliability excellence, not to point fingers or blame anyone because something bad happened.
Thank you, Brian.
No problem. Next slide. So today, I'm just going to focus on first the long-term reliability assessment, and then later I'll get into, I've got a few slides on the MRO regional winter assessment, the most recent one that we published for this winter that we're currently in the middle of. So long-term reliability assessment, it's a 10-year planning horizon, far beyond just a seasonal look. The first 5 years are detailed generation and transmission adequacy assessments, while the second 5 years focus more on the identification and analysis and projection of trends in peak demand, electric supply, and transmission adequacy, as well as other trends that could impact system reliability. So a lot of good information, I would say, in these assessments, and the idea is to, make them to where someone who maybe doesn't have a deep technical expertise could still digest this information, and it's something that will be helpful to them. Next slide. So this is an infographic from the 2022 long-term reliability assessment. This one was published in December, and I guess some key takeaways from this infographic are, you look at the high risk and the elevated risk, and what does that really mean? So high risk, something that's important to MRO because MISO fell under this category. These areas are defined as areas that do not meet the resource adequacy criteria in terms of assessments. And we're talking resource adequacy concerning the assessments. And what, to break that down further, at some point in the planning horizon, the electricity supply does not meet the demand forecast. And that's how MISO ended up being identified as a high risk assessment area. And you look at elevated risk, this is one where SPP falls into. This is areas that do not meet resource adequacy criteria during extreme and prolonged weather events. And I think when I get into my slides, maybe 4 or 5 slides down the road, the reserve margin discussion will help with this, and I'll briefly jump into that, I guess, right now, because I think that will help. You talk about resource adequacy. One of the ways that we define that is by looking at reserve margin. So reserve margin is the primary metric used to measure resource adequacy in these assessments. And it's to simplify it, you look at the difference between the on-peak capacity. So you got all your resources over here, your anticipated amount of generation compared to your peak demand. You take the difference between those two and divide it by the peak demand, and you get a percentage. And you compare that percentage to what we call the reference margin level. And we look at that and say, hey, this assessment area maybe define their reference margin level as 16%. Well, what is their reserve margin? It's 25%. So they're above their reference margin level, they're good. Whereas on the flip side, if they came up with 12%, but their reference margin level was 16, that would be a problem. That would imply that you are not meeting the resource adequacy criteria.
Brian, pardon my interruption again, if I could, but it seems like kind of an apropos time for me to ask this question,
Sure.
especially when you're talking here about these reliability assessments, and in particular, the high risk category. I think given the last, I'm thinking 2 or 3 NERC winter reliability assessment reports of recent vintage, the fact that MISO did fall into this high risk category has become somewhat widely known. But my question to you, from your perspective in assessing the implications of this, or even the causes of this, my question really is, to what extent has an accelerated pace in transitioning to renewables within MISO jeopardized MISO reliability and has caused NERC to express these concerns?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And Mark T. Meyer might get into this during his regional risk assessment presentation. If you look at the verbiage under the MISO write-up in this infographic, I mean, that it points to projected 1,300 megawatts short, mainly due to retirements. And what we're seeing is, when you retire those conventional resources and you are replacing them with renewable resources, the capacity is there, but the energy might not be. So, if you retire a 100 megawatt coal plant and you replace it with a 100 megawatt solar plant, that's not really, 1 for 1, right? Like, you're not going to be able to get as much consistently out of solar as you would out of coal. And that's not to say that we need to stop replacing coal with renewable. It's just something we need to be mindful of and plan for, and understand that when you plug in a renewable for a conventional, it's not always tit for tat. And I don't know if I actually answered your question. So
no. I think you did. I appreciate the context within which you answered. I think the essence of what I'm taking away from what you said is that there are substantial potential risks that come from a too rapid switch from dispatchable to intermittent.
Absolutely, and that's been documented. I'm not afraid to say that on this call. That's been documented in multiple assessments, and I believe it might even be in this presentation in a few slides. So you can go to the next slide, Tasha.
Thank you, Brian.
Sure. So let's just talk about the SPP assessment area for a second, because that's the one that you guys would be most concerned with, considering that's the assessment area that you are in, the state of Kansas. The reserve margins are above the reference margin level throughout the 10-year assessment period in the LTRA, which is a good thing. There was a slight increase in internal demand over the assessment period. But keep in mind, this is a 10-year projection. So we don't know for sure. And the entities are giving us, specifically the assessment areas, are giving us this information. And it's a starting point. But when you look at electrification of society and the grid, this might be more than what we expect in terms of increasing the internal demand. And then, of course, steady increase in wind generation across the SPP assessment area as SPP continues to see more wind in the generation interconnection queue. And that wind is also coming to fruition every year. The nameplate capacity increases. Next slide. So a little bit about the resource mix. We got a large number of retirements that that was a key finding out of the LTRA, and this is not just in MRO, this is continent-wide, 88 gigawatts of fossil-fired and nuclear generating capacity confirmed for retirements. And this is just what was reported. I mean, we do expect more retirements than what's actually being reported to us and that we share in the LTRA. These units are, a lot of them are getting older. So, there's always that, evaluation is, is it cost effective to continue to run this unit? We've seen it with nuclear units and not doing well in the market construct, especially the smaller nuclear plants, those around 400 or 500 megawatts. They were some early retirements, some of them in the MRO footprint. So you can never be sure about that exact number. We know it's going to be a big number. And the last bullet, the robust planning process for managing the pace. We've already mentioned that once, and I think you'll see it again. It's very important that we pay attention to the pace and make sure we're managing that appropriately. And I see a question from Commissioner French.
Yeah, this is a particular area of interest of mine. I'm the Kansas representative of the Southwest Power Pool and the president of the Regional State Committee this year. And we're gonna spend a working group at the SPP. It's called the Resource Energy and Adequacy Leadership Team. And we're going to be looking at all these issues of, how do we stay proactive to ensure, we've got not only sort of the bare minimum planning reserve margin, but maybe taking more of a nuanced look at, how do you make sure you have the resource mix that has the right attributes to keep the lights on during every hour of every day, looking at new metrics like expected unserved energy. My question is, we are trying to stay proactive on this issue, try to stay ahead of certainly the challenges we've seen in areas to the south of us, but now sort of the challenges we've also seen in, I'll just say MISO, they're probably ahead of us in generator retirements. And so we want to stay more proactive on that. So there's lots of conversations going on at SPP. What do you all do to track that? Do you attend SPP working group meetings? Do you primarily just interface with members and try to understand what they individually are doing? Is there more opportunity for coordination between SPP and MRO to try to understand the sort of the proactive steps we're trying to take? Do you all want to give input into those processes, or as the regulator, is it more appropriate for you all to stand back and hear about it after the fact? I guess I'd just invite any thoughts you have on how you sort of view the ongoing efforts that are going on by members and within SPP, and how much interaction you all should have with that.
Yeah, thank you for the questions, Commissioner French. The main way that I personally, and probably a lot of people on my team, interact with SPP specifically is through our advisory council. We have a member on the advisory council that we receive updates from quarterly when they come to our meetings. It's something we've talked about at MRO, like how closely should we be following, these working groups, and you guys are well aware there's a large number of them, and not just SPP, MISO as well. So just trying to balance. We're a small shop. It's not like we have hundreds of employees, but what makes the most sense in terms of our time? Should we be following, everything that has resource adequacy in the title with MISO and SPP, or, do we pick out one that we think gives us the best bang for our buck? And maybe Mark will talk or speak to this when he gets on, but I know we've had some discussions about him personally following some groups and increasing awareness around what the RTOs are doing. Very good. I mean, I think it's a positive to the extent you're able, but I will absolutely agree with you that there are at least
4 or 5 working groups just at SPP focused on resource adequacy. So I understand that's a challenge.
Yeah, Brian, I was going to add to the point you just made, because it is seen as maybe a gap that MRO has with tracking kind of what's going on, and there's a lot going on at the RTOs, and so I am going to start following a couple committees at SPP, probably one more closely than the other, but the Operating Reliability Working Group is one that I'll be following more closely, and then the Supply Adequacy Working Group as well, because I know that there's a lot of activities. And at MISO, they have a reliability subcommittee that I'll be following that kind of does a similar thing to the ORWG at SPP. And then they also have a resource adequacy group. And so one interesting thing I can take from that, from that regional view, again, this is kind of a benefit of MRO, taking a more kind of regional view is by participating in those meetings, I can hear kind of what's going on at both RTOs and compare and contrast, to be honest, and what activities they are doing to try to solve some of these risks. And I think that's a role for us to be able to then kind of partner with them to really understand what each are doing and how that's going to address these concerns.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And something else we have to navigate is, we don't really have authority over like market functions. That's something that we stay out of. The reliability standards that we cover around transmission operations, facilities, communication, protection systems. When it comes to markets, that's we kind of stay out of that. But that there is a level of awareness that we need to have because everyone knows that markets impact reliability. It's just a matter of how involved should we be in those discussions when it comes to markets. You can go to the next slide, Tasha.
Brian, if I could, Dwight Keene again. To me, resource mix is a critical issue in terms of reliability, and I can tell it is with you as well. It's a critical issue. So I guess in terms of looking at this from the MRO perspective, I'm going to ask you a really difficult question here. How does MRO either cope or participate in recalibrating retirement timelines of fossil resources that may be established by state laws when those timelines may not correspond to technological or practical realities?
You are correct. That is a difficult question. I would say by having conversations like this, our job is kind of to assess and point out the risk and scream about it, like, hey, we need to do something different. We don't necessarily have authority to create a reliability standard that says you can't retire these type of units. So what needs to happen is we just have to keep educating folks that can make some of those decisions around retirements or what the risk is, and document it, not just have it in words saying there's a risk if you retire these units at this pace. Like we need data to support it, and unfortunately these winter storms that roll through and we have these long-term outages and people losing power for days. Those are things that we can point to and explain maybe why we should slow down on some of these changes. I wish there was less of that we could use, but that does help to make our point at times.
Thank you for your candor.
So another slide real quick on the resource mix. Just the LTRA kind of points out this chart specifically is retiring generation through 2027. I think the previous slide said 88 gigawatts, but that was through the 10-year period. This is just through 2027. It's still a massive number of retirements confirmed, and then you add in the unconfirmed. And then you look at the resources, which is a testament to the change in resource mix. Natural gas, we've seen an increase since 2021. Coal is slowly going away, and we continue to see retirements. And I'm not sure that we'll ever build a new coal power plant. Nuclear power plants, kind of the same thing. I know there's one under construction in Georgia, I believe, but it's been under construction for a long time. And those plants aren't easy to build in terms of quickness. And solar and wind, we continue to see the increase. So we know where things are going. Solar and wind are here to stay, and people will continue to build them. So we need to learn to operate the system with them on the grid reliably. Next slide. So these are some of the recommendations from the LTRA. First and foremost, manage the pace of generator retirements to ensure energy and essential reliability services needs are met. We've talked about this most of the call on how important that is. Promoting use of extreme weather scenarios and resource planning, getting entities that are responsible for planning the system to incorporate extreme weather scenarios, because we continue to see them. I don't think they're going away anytime soon, so we need to be prepared. Expand resource adequacy evaluations beyond reserve margins, and Mark will speak to this later. We identify this as a high risk in the MRO region. The way that reserve margins are being planned and stated, we need to take another look at that. We need to be looking at energy for all hours and all seasons, not just the peak demand. There's more to be done. Risk from interdependent natural gas infrastructure. You need to be working with the natural gas industry and how critical it is to natural gas power plants. As we continue to build more of those, and in extreme situations, we need to make sure that they have the fuel that they need. Performance and integration issues with solar and wind. I just mentioned that earlier. And increase on operating with more distribution resources. I didn't talk a lot about that, but distributed energy resources are also something that we're seeing more of. And in terms of adding resources to the grid, the challenge with them is that we don't necessarily have the visibility, because a lot of them are behind the meter. And then the electrification on future electricity demand and infrastructure, which is something I spoke on, that when I was explaining the 10-year assessment period, there's so many unknowns around the electrification of the grid and what demand might look like 5 years from now if all of us have electric vehicles.
Ron, I've got a quick question. In terms of managing the pace of retirements, I know, Kansas has a number of coal plants, and one of our concerns has been, if those are going to be in a reserve status, so to speak, for high need periods, getting compensation through the integrated market and through SPP is going to continue to be important. And there's some actions being taken on that, but it doesn't seem to fully match what might be really required to keep those units operational. Is that something that MRO is conveying to SPP just sort of informally or via these reports, or is that something that Commissioner French needs to grab a hold of your reports and push those out? So I'm throwing you under the bus, Commissioner. So
that's another one of those topics that we don't necessarily harp on, Jeff. When you start talking about financial incentives, I do believe that was mentioned in the latest FERC NERC inquiry, and Mark would know for sure. that there needs to, and I think this was specific to like cold weather, not necessarily just plant operations, throughout the year, but more so cold weather. Financial incentives for units to properly weatherize their systems or their units. But there also probably needs to be a discussion around some type of compensation for these units outside of that, so that availability is critical, Jeff. So I'm with you, but once again, it's something that we haven't stated as a recommendation out of our assessments that I'm aware of, but it needs to be discussed.
Sure, it's a logical conclusion, and it seems like, it's on Commissioner Prince. It's all his responsibility.
Brian, if we could go back, it's Dwight Keene again. If we go back to the prior slide just for a moment.
Sure.
First of all, I'll say with respect to your colloquy there with Jeff, in terms of that cost share that you just addressed there, you're speaking to the choir here. I'd say amen. Thank you for that. I mean, I think that's exactly the concern we have. We provide this at the ready generation here, and are we adequately compensated for it? That's a rhetorical question. My question here on slide 4, if you go down to bullet point number 4 here, in terms of this mitigation of risk from the interdependence of the gas infrastructure, and in light of the events that came about as a result of Winter Storm Uri, in particular, a more recent example, upon whom, in your judgment, does the reliability responsibility lie in providing communication channels that are sufficient enough to guarantee that interdependence actually works, that is, between the gas infrastructure and the utilities? Is that primarily the responsibility of the RTOs or others?
Cool. I might have to pass that one to Mark. I think the RTOs can help with that because they have that wide area of view. They are, in a simple way of putting it, the coordinators. And I feel like SPP maybe took some steps to be better at that after Winter Storm Uri. I believe New England ISO might even actually have like a natural gas like department that they coordinate, because they lean so heavily on natural gas supply for their fleet, that they have people dedicated to talking to those folks that control those pipelines to ensure they have the fuel during those extreme weather scenarios. But I see Mark, you got your camera on and unmuted. I'm assuming you have some to add.
Yeah, well, I think that's the $1 million question. Who, when you talk about gas and electric interdependencies, who is responsible? And there's a lot of, I'll call it finger pointing, that goes on when you have events like Uri, when you have events like Elliott that we just had, a couple months ago, and I think that's something that is both industries are trying to grasp, is how can we do a better job of partnering with each other, understanding their unique business models. Both business models have their differences, and that can create challenges on both sides. And I will kind of reiterate some points Brian made about RTOs, since they, especially ones that like our MISO and SPP, they're also the balancing authority for their footprints. They're the ones ultimately responsible to make sure that there's enough energy to meet the demand. And a part of that, especially during these cold weather events, is, do we have enough natural gas supply and transportation so that these units can run? And I think my personal opinion, the more active role that they can take, I think that is a good example for other people to follow, and really trying to work more closely with the gas industry. Because I think very siloed industries as they sit today, even though they're so dependent on each other, they're still, I think, as there's actually a forum now at the North American Electric Standards Board, NASB, And I've been on a few of those calls, especially early on. I think they're trying to work through this, but there's just a lot of people talking past each other because they truly just don't understand each other's business models and how they operate. So, I think that's the call for action from this perspective. Is it's probably not just one group. It's not just the RTO's responsibility. It's not just whoever's responsibility. It really needs to be kind of an all-in perspective on how these two industries can work more closely together to solve some of these issues.
I think that's a pretty holistic approach that you suggest. I accept that, certainly. The problem is that it doesn't become theoretically at the time of need. Theory disappears and practicality sets in. So some entities, something has to step in and actually make the decisions that affect the coordination and communication that makes this happen. Somebody has to have that. That's not a theoretical thing at the point of need. So for that, I don't see who else that would be but the grid operator, in our case, SPP. I think that would be where the ultimate responsibility should rest.
Yeah, and I'll also add to that, when you listen to some of these NASB calls on the gas electric infrastructure dependencies, they recognize, and they, this Winter Storm Uri inquiry report, kind of directed them or gave them the kind of the direction they need to go with their conversations, but they already are acknowledging and recognizing they can only go so far because, again, they don't have authority. And actually, they've even made comments around, we can put out recommendations to FERC as an example on actions they could potentially take to kind of force, and I'll use the word force, the relationship that needs to happen between these two industries. And I think that's even bigger than RTOs, to be honest, as well.
Appreciate your answer. Thank you, Mark.
Brian, this is Leo. I've got a question that goes back to what Jeff was commenting on. You mentioned that you don't have a lot of really input into the, how they price coal resources, for example, as far as the price that needs to be done to give them a better feel of the market. But you would have resources that would reflect the maintenance issues maybe that coal has seen because they're, ramping up and down, chasing the wind. Do you have any trends that would show like an increase in outages? I know the plants are all getting older, but is there increase in outages that you can point to that you can tie to the fact that they're, going up and down in capacity now all the time as far as their generating capacity?
I think the simple answer is yes. I know we had an entity present at our reliability conference a couple years ago that talked through the cycling of some of their older units due to renewable resources being online more has impacted the life of those units, because a lot of these units are not designed to be ramping up and down or shutting down and restarting. So that's a lot of wear and tear that they're just not capable of handling. Region wide, I would probably say yes, but specifically that I have evidence from at least two entities where they showed us the numbers, and we were believers after that, I guess. And we put language in our assessments that point to cycling of units, creating more outages because these units aren't designed to be operated in that way.
Obviously, life could be extended if they could, increase the maintenance, increase maintenance, take care of those kind of things to get as much out of them as possible. Is there any way to quantify that action in order to try to understand what type of pricing mechanism ought to be allowed in order to cover some of those maintenance costs that are there because of the renewables, the impact on them?
I would say yes, but I'd need to look more into that and talk to some folks offline. I did kind of capture that as an action item, so very, very good question. All right, I think I've got about 5 more slides, but I'm going to fly through them so that I can give Mark some time because he's got some important stuff to talk to you guys about. So if you go to the next slide, these slides are around the MRO regional assessment. So, I've been talking about the LTRA, which is a continent-wide 10-year look at reliability. This is more MRO region seasonal. So we're just talking about the winter for 2022, 2023. And some key takeaways from this assessment. Once again, the link is at the end of this presentation. We got MISO showing up as a high risk based on reserve margin. You can go to the next slide. Same thing here, next slide, just different numbers. I think this will probably set up Mark as well. So when you look at reserve margin under normal conditions, or what I would say ideal conditions, it's very high. Like SPP is at 70%, but then you add in typical outages, that drops down to 44.5%. And then you look at extreme conditions, which to me is what we want to capture. That's the true risk. That's what we care about, those extreme conditions, because that's when you're most likely to lose power. You see you get down to 9.3%, which is part of the reason we had them identified as, or we identified them as elevated, not necessarily high. You look at MISO, they're actually in the negative when it comes to extreme conditions. And once again, just taking your reserve margins and comparing that to the reference margin level is where we get that from. You can go to the next slide. Recommendations for the regulator out of the assessment. Seeing a pattern here: preserve critical generation resources at risk of retirement ahead of the winter season to maintain reliability. We've actually already talked about all of these. Understanding requests for environmental and transportation waivers that place fuel at risk. If you guys have control over that, I know every state's different with what they have control over, but I think that's something very important to consider. Support electric load, natural gas distribution company conservations and public appeals during emergencies. So I believe everyone's doing that. And seek local policies that continually balance new and different generation resources with increased power demand. The key is the balance of the resource mix. I know a lot of states are shooting for the carbon free by a specific date. And that's not a bad thing, but we just need to be careful and thoughtful about the right resource mix. Next slide. And I think this next one is more for industry. So we'll go to the next slide. And Mr. Mark Tiemeyer, hand it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. And I kind of failed to mention in my introduction kind of what my role was at MRO, but I'm the principal technical advisor, which I can best describe as chief engineer. I actually don't necessarily fit into any particular department with the MRO, whether it be compliance or reliability assessments or the security. I'm separated from all of that. But my main focus is on a couple of different things. And one of those things is the regional risk assessment that MRO produces. And this is our 4th year actually producing this assessment. And I do have a quick slide just on a kind of overall process look at that assessment. And at the heart of why MRO does this risk assessment is the mission of the company, which is to identify and prioritize risks to the reliable and secure operations of the bulk power system. And it's very specific to the MRO footprint. So we want to make sure that we are broadcasting the risks that we see specific to our members and our entities in the footprint. But another big purpose for this assessment is to be an input to MRO's strategic direction and where we want to go as a company and as a regulator, which helps us decide on our annual work plans. Our advisory councils also take this risk assessment as an input to their work plans that they develop every year. And the main goal is to develop work plans that address those top risks that we see, again, to that secure and reliable operations of the bulk power system. And this is a very circular process, a continual process. There really is no start and end per se, even though we do this annually or have an annual report. This is something that's always top of mind at MRO and definitely top of mind at entities as well. But we do start with if I want to say start, we do look at identification of the risks, and we do that in several ways. We actually use a lot of the assessments that Brian talked about as an input to our process. You'll see very similar themes in our risk assessment along with those other assessments, because we use those as kind of helping us define where the industry has been and also where it's going. But we also collaborate with the advisory councils that Tasha mentioned within the MRO to make sure that our stakeholders are involved in this process and that they're helping us basically identify some of these risks, in addition to some of the event reports and other things that Tasha mentioned are great inputs as well. And then the last thing I'll mention from an identification perspective is NERC does have a committee. It's called the Reliability Issues Steering Committee or Risk Committee that does an overall North American wide assessment of risk on the electric grid. And so that's used as a pretty hefty input as well to our process. But one key component is the next one, prioritization, because these risks we identify mean nothing if we can't prioritize them. And so MRO actually has a tool that we created that's assessing both the impact and the likelihood of these risks that we identified. And we're taking into account, for at least from a likelihood perspective, what have we seen recently on events? What trends are we seeing emerge? Are there any controls like NERC standards out there that would help address or levelize some of this risk? And we take that into account, looking also then at the impact, which is mostly focused on, how broad of an issue is this within the MRO footprint. And we actually have a panel of subject matter experts that we draw upon for this process, both from our advisory councils and from MRO staff. And we apply this risk assessment tool to prioritize the risks. We have a 2-day workshop every fall. That it's a slog to get through 16 hours of discussing risks, but it's a really good collaborative approach that we take in, again, making sure that the risks we identify as top priority are really a shared risk that we see across our membership. We'll then take kind of those prioritized risks and validate them against some of the oversight committee, actually the oversight committee to those advisory groups within the MRO, looking for more impact from those, input from those subject matter experts to make sure that we hit the mark as far as what we prioritized as risks. Then, of course, we will publish a report, and that's one of the main products to this process. Again, as an education tool, as an awareness tool, not only for our membership, but for state regulatory commissions or other stakeholders within our industry, which I know Tasha mentioned. We did just post that on Monday of this week, and it is on MRO's website. If you go to our main MRO.net page and scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's kind of a recent news section there, and you can find it there. But then the second kind of major product of this process is development of actions. It's the call to action. That's what the report is meant to be. Is a call to action to address these top risks. And as I mentioned previously, MRO takes that and puts it into our strategic plan. It guides the development of kind of our annual work plans and our goals within the organization. And then we do kind of push as well on members and entities to really look at our risk assessment and try to conceptualize that in their organizations as well as a way for them to be taking actions to mitigate these risks as well. If you want to go to the next slide, Tasha. So this is just an infographic kind of showcasing the results from this year's risk assessment. And I'll first just cover some of the factors that are underpinning all the risks that you kind of see here. They're briefly summarized in that assessment overview on the top right side there. But, and Brian's already talked about a lot of these, we're seeing the rapid changes in the generation resource mix, and also the technology within this industry as well, that are moving us away from what we are used to, which is that centralized dispatchable generation, and it's now becoming more dispersed and much more variable. And along with that, a main driver as well is a lot of these dispersed and variable resources are inverter based, so they're not synchronous machines. They don't connect to the, they connect to the grid in a much different way than a traditional coal plant or even natural gas plant would. And so they behave much differently, and in ways that I think engineers in our industry are still struggling with, trying to really fully understand the impact of how these machines should operate to make sure that they're maintaining reliability. And along with that, and Brian mentioned this too about the changes in consumer demand. The push for electrification, not only of transportation, but more recently now even in space heating, is going to increase, I think, the demand that we are going to see. And on top of that, it's going to change daily and seasonal patterns for when electricity is needed the most. And part of that as well is looking at distributed energy resources, which are usually installed at customer sites, so behind the meter, if you will. And mostly today, at least in the form of rooftop solar, but I think you see a lot more home battery installations as well. And this is introducing the possibility and the presence of a bidirectional flow between the transmission grid and where our distribution systems connect up and serve those customers. And that kind of masks the demand that you might see on a day-to-day basis. And of course, when you look at solar, it's weather dependent, so a sunny day in the middle of winter is going to look much differently from a load pattern perspective than a cloudy day in the winter, just because you have that contribution from these distribution or rooftop solar installations. And then lastly, and I don't think we touched on this, but it's absolutely a main driver for a lot of these challenges is the increase in extreme weather. And we're not just limited to extreme cold, which obviously has been a driver for some major events the last 2 or 3 years, but it's also extreme hot weather, floods, which we saw in California here recently, and then of course the drought conditions that we've seen across the US. Those really challenge our energy system in ways that we haven't necessarily had to worry about, and the prolonged impact from some of those extreme weather events as well is something that we haven't really been able to necessarily had issues with in the past. And it does seem like there's no data behind this, but it seems like we have more 100-year weather events every year than we've ever had before. And of course, all of these different factors increase uncertainty, and uncertainty is of course where you breed risk. Risk is the definition of kind of trying to manage uncertainty. And so we have uncertainty on kind of how that extreme weather is impacting the grid, or uncertainty in the fuel availability for generation that we haven't seen before. And then of course, uncertainty in load forecasting, which challenges our ability to make sure we have enough energy to meet the load. So all those factors kind of bubble up to us identifying our risks and ranking our risks, which you can kind of see in the middle of the screen there with that risk matrix. And as I talked about previously, we look at both the impact of the risk and then the likelihood. So from our current assessment, we've got 8 risks that are in the orange area, which is a kind of high risk category, 4 of which are considered a major impact. And when we talk about major impact, that means if this risk were to be realized, it would impact the grid and the reliability of the grid at a kind of reliability coordinator level. So a entire SPP footprint or an entire MISO footprint level. And then we have 4 high risks as well that are at the moderate impact. And that particular impact definition is more focused on maybe only a portion of an RC's footprint. So it wouldn't be something that you'd see show up in kind of in a broad entirety of a reliability coordinator. But my focus here today, I really do want to focus on just these top risks, and specifically the top risks that are related to resource adequacy. So there's 4 risks that we've identified within MRO that do have a relationship with resource adequacy. So, and I'll get into detail on them, but that's the planning reserve risk, our energy reliability risk, generation unavailability risk, and then transmission line ratings. So if you want to move to the next slide, Tasha. So let's start looking at planning reserves, and Brian already mentioned kind of reserve margins, and I'll just reiterate some of those points about planning reserve margin, which is basically the difference between how much generation capacity you have and how much load you think you're going to have for whether it be a season, whether it be for a year. It's very focused on serving a peak load with a generation capacity. And so it takes into account a lot of different assumptions when calculating that planning reserve margin. What's your accredited generation capacity? How much generation do you have available to cover that load? Of course, you need to decrement that by some level of expected generation outage, and that's including planned and forced. And then, of course, your forecasted peak load. So it's tying back into those exact same uncertainties I was speaking about earlier, and that's what creates the challenge with the current way that planning reserve margins are calculated. Is the assumptions that are made are probably more predicated to a previous time when we had a large amount of dispatchable generation. We had generation that had fuel available 24/7, like in the example of on-site coal storage, or even on-site oil storage in some cases. And those assumptions, I'll say, kind of are getting more thrown out the window with the new regime that we have. And the assumptions made into what these reserve margins are look at kind of a loss of load expectation calculation, which is looking at how much generation would we need to minimize a loss of load event to just one day every 10 years. And so you hear the 1 in every 10 a lot when you hear about reserve margins. That's the standard by which I think most planning coordinators, or whatever that term is, look at their resource adequacy. And one thing I'll say about that is it doesn't factor in the magnitude or the duration of a loss of load event. It's just that it happens or doesn't happen. And there's a major assumption in there as well that there's fuel available, like I already mentioned. Again, it's hard to conceptualize when you have some of these large events we've had in the last couple of years. Are we having these 1 every 10 year events a little more often than 1 every 10 years? But I will say the RTOs, MISO and SPP, have a similar awareness of this concern and issue. SPP in particular, which I'm sure you guys are well aware of, just recently changed their reserve margin or planning reserve margin requirement from 12% to 15%, which I think is effective this year, which came with a lot of discussion, I know. And so it's recognized that these margins, as calculated, may not cover the full extent of what we need going forward. And I see Commissioner French, you've got your video on, so you got a question?
No, I was probably just going to make an editorial comment, but I think you've touched on a lot of that. I do think SPP is at the urging of the states, actually, because in SPP, resource adequacy is primarily the responsibility of the regional state committee. They've given that to us, and at our urging, I think SPP is trying to become much more proactive. I think as you mentioned, it's planning reserve margin probably needs to increase, but planning reserve margin is not everything. And so we are looking at things like expected unserved energy, which would tend to reflect the magnitude of events and the fact that they could occur in any hour of any day. We are moving toward performance-based accreditation of our dispatchable resources and looking at probabilistic accreditation of our intermittent resources and trying to get more granular on what can we actually count on. We are looking at adding a extreme weather scenario to our planning scenarios. I think that could be helpful to address, what you talked about, which is sometimes these the trouble we have with things like extreme weather events and fuel supply or plant outages. Unfortunately, while those events may be rare, they actually tend to be correlated. And so you can't just look at them on a non-correlated basis. You have to sometimes assume that those are happening at the same time. And that is something I think we need to get better at planning for. I think we're going to get more proactive there. But I appreciate you bringing all that up, because these are all things that weigh heavily on us, and we've got to get out ahead of it. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Commissioner French. And actually, you're going to hear some of these themes and some future slides I have as well. But if you want to, Tasha, go to the next slide. I'm not going to hit on this too much because it's a rehash a little bit of what Brian already showed, but in a more graphical form. So these are graphs taken from, I believe it's NERC's winter assessments from this year, or for this winter. And it really does showcase the assumptions made into the process and how they can drastically change the end result. So if you look at the SPP graph on the right, there's an anticipated resource bar graph, of 70.8 gigawatts. That's your assumed capacity going into the winter season, but you do have to decrement it for potential maintenance outages. That's one way to look at that. And then you might have to decrement it again for forced, depending on your scenarios. And then you might look at extreme conditions and decrement it even more, to the point that your 70.8 gigawatts is now, looking like maybe only 50 as far as what you might have in an extreme weather event. And then you could couple like your load forecasting, because these are correlated events, right? During an extreme weather event, you're probably not going to have normal demand. You're going to have extreme demand. And you can look at the right column there and see the difference in demand between a normal and an extreme event. And you start eating away at any margin that you had, to the point that, it's I think in SPP's case, they're in a much better position than MISO, but your really high margins are diminished pretty substantially. Tasha, why don't you go to the next slide? And one thing I'll highlight, this is not just a winter problem, this is a summer problem too. And I think previous versions of MRO's regional risk assessment have focused more on the winter season, but we're changing that for 2023 to really try to focus again year round. And this is not just one season or another. I'll go to the next slide, Tasha. So our next risk is what we call energy reliability planning, or it's actually the lack thereof of energy reliability planning. And Brian hit on this, looking at it from a capacity construct just really isn't applicable anymore. And so we have to change our approach to looking at energy availability and energy availability for the entire year. And in doing that, we have to account for a lot of things that we maybe didn't account for before, with the first being, that unassured fuel supply. What sort of scenarios out there could exist that would be a common mode issue for multiple plants from our fuel transportation or production environment? And what's a reasonable scenario to use when we're trying to look at what energy might be available? Along with that, and when we talk about fuel supplies, it's not limited, to just fossil fuels, if you will. you can consider the wind and the sun as a fuel for those resources as well. And of course, those fuel supplies are not consistent. We can't control them. We can't, necessarily demand them at certain places of the country at certain times. So you have to look at, and when you're looking at energy availability, events again, or scenarios where you might not have the wind, you might not have the sun, or you may only have portions of it depending on how large your footprint is. You have to really get realistic as far as what you want to assume you're going to have available from an energy perspective from those types of resources. And that could also extends a little bit into, it's not so much a fuel supply, but other industries, and the impact that those industries have on energy production. More specifically, you could think about our railroad network as a supply chain for coal. And if that's disrupted in any way in a large scale, how could that disrupt that particular fleet of generation? Although I will say the benefit that coal has is they do have fuel storage on site. So the impact of a rail issue might be a short-term one. But then also water supply. You look at hydro resources, and that's impacted by extreme weather. Diminishing pond levels at hydroelectric plants, and then also water is used as a cooling source for a lot of fossil fuel generation. Will they be limited in certain ways because of the lack of cooling water? So those are all inputs that an energy reliability planning construct really do need to look at. And one that is definitely, and I'll get into this later, is a push at the NERC level, which is a shared approach from MRO and other entities or regional entities in the ERO. Is this is a challenge we have to solve, and we have to be consistent in how we do these, how we plan for energy, and not leave it at the whim of individual entities. And then, of course, the forecasted load I already talked about, and how volatile that's going to become with electrification and with behind the meter distributed generation. Again, that's something that has to be accounted for when we're looking at energy, and it's also a tool. I'll be honest. If there's an increase in responsive load, so load that you might be able to curtail during some of these challenging conditions, that's a huge benefit to being able to provide or plan for the energy that you need. But there needs to be an awareness of that, and also magnitude. Excuse me. So I want to go to the next slide, Tasha, because I think this will help kind of frame up when we talk about capacity versus energy. These next few slides, I think, do a pretty good job. So on this slide, the two pie charts you see here on the left is basically an installed nameplate within the MRO of all the different resource types. And then on the right is what is treated as available capacity to meet a peak load scenario. So that traditional planning reserve margin analysis. And you'll notice that the differences between the two. So I'll start with the obvious one, which is the green pie piece, which is the wind. So within MRO, there's over 50 gigawatts of installed nameplate capacity of wind. But when you look at what's available to be used as capacity to meet load, it's only a little over 12 gigawatts, or 10% of the entire fleet. Whereas you look at coal, which is in black, it's 26% of the overall nameplate, but it provides 32% of the available capacity to meet a peak load scenario. Similar for natural gas, it's 31% nameplate, 39% for usable capacity, I'll call it, lack of a better term. But this only tells part of the story, because you're still talking about capacity and not energy. So if you go to the next slide, Tasha, when you start having to think about energy, you get an example like this, and this is a hypothetical kind of 7-day look at an electric system here. But the green dash line is essentially that capacity component I was talking about on the last slide that's on the right. it's that capacity that's available to meet a peak load. It's not necessarily the installed capacity. But on top of that, in capacity, we know it's not going to be available 100% of the time. And so the available energy, which is the red line there, really shows what actually we have on a system that can meet the load at that given time. So you're going to have a difference between the green and the red because of a planned maintenance outage, a forced outage. You might have derates because of fuel issues. And again, that's not limited to just like a fossil fuel. That counts for wind and the sun as well. So we always know the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't blow or shine all the time. So you derate a capacity from a plant like that because you don't have that fuel. And this example just showcases what could happen in like an extreme weather event starting like on day 5 or maybe a little bit at the end of day 4. You start seeing a lot of generating plants become unavailable, go offline for probably a various number of reasons, but it reduces that available energy pretty substantially to the point, at the beginning of the morning of day 5, where your energy available is no longer there to meet your expected demand, which is the blue line. And then that whole red shaded area is essentially that unserved energy that you would see because of not having enough available. So that's pretty significant in this example. This might fit under the 1 day of every 10 year standard, but from an energy loss perspective, that shows like 173, I think, gigawatt hours of lost demand within that red shaded area in this example. That's pretty significant. That's a significant event, even though you could argue, if you looked at your planning, your planning margin here between the green line and the blue, you were adequate. But in reality, that doesn't tell the whole story. So that's the kind of the crux of energy reliability and why it's so important that we move to a construct that accounts for that versus just strictly capacity. All right, go ahead, Tasha, to the next slide. Kind of related, of course, because we're talking about generation meeting load, is the challenges that we've seen in the last, really the last decade in having large extreme weather events that have challenged generation's ability to stay online. And again, it's a multitude of reasons. I think you see it mostly in the southern portion of the US, where natural gas generation in particular is not well winterized for sub-freezing temperatures, and especially prolonged sub-freezing temperatures. But the story doesn't end there. So the electric gas infrastructure interdependencies we talked about previously, that's a major component of this as well. The natural gas system was built mainly to serve customer demand for heating. And of course, as the emergence of natural gas to use for electric generation has evolved, that's become a much bigger player in the usage of that gas system. But as we kind of previously talked about, those two industries really aren't well aligned in how to meet the challenges during these extreme weather conditions, which again is that correlation. That's when you're going to have the most gas usage for heating as well. So it really challenges both industries to make sure we're fulfilling our missions, which are both extremely important. And of course, as I already talked about in the previous example, when you have generation outages like this, and you see so many of them over a short period of time, you're really straining the ability to meet your demand. I'll go to the next slide, Tasha. Now, MRO has, and actually NERC as well, has done some things around this in light of those events. MRO in particular, in the last 2 years, we've developed this winterization program for generators where we will survey generation, asking for their weather preparedness plans, cold weather preparedness plans, and then we actually also do site visits, which we did 6 site visits last year across our footprint to help as a learning opportunity, not only for us, but also for the units themselves on how they could better prepare their plants for cold weather, which of course NERC has also put out a lot of materials on that as well. They had a workshop last year, actually maybe in the last 2 years, on cold weather preparedness. There's actually a new standard that's going into effect April 1st at the NERC level that is going to require cold weather preparedness plans of generator owners and operators, which is related to some of these NERC alerts that they've done in the last couple of years as well. And then we already talked about the Gas Electric Forum at the North American Electric Standards Board. Go to the next slide, Tasha. All right, and one other action that's come out of a lot of these risk assessments, and this one's related more to energy reliability assessments, is a new kind of NERC industry group called the Energy Reliability Assessments Task Force, or ERATF. And this is a group that's comprised of kind of a broad group of stakeholders from utilities and from RTOs, from the Electric Power Research Institute. There's some manufacturers of electric generation on this task force as well. And then of course, from the Electric Reliability Organization, and with the goal of bringing awareness to energy reliability assessments or energy availability issues, and then also to be the kind of the driver for helping define what those should look like. So this group has put out at least one white paper to date talking about energy adequacy and doing that with energy constrained resources, and kind of sets the framework for how we might do these assessments in the future, as well as some of the framework for potentially new standards that may be put in place. There's actually 2 what they call standard authorization requests, or SARs, within the NERC space out there that are in progress, which could result in operational and planning standards related to energy reliability. And then this group also is looking at identifying different tools that could be used to help with these, realistically what probably have to become hourly simulations, discussing different market incentives that might be needed to account for energy reliability. And then, they don't have control of these things, but tariff changes as well. I think they have a goal of wanting to speak to some of those challenges that might be not prioritizing energy over capacity. And I think with that, Tasha, you can go. Well, I guess I do have one more. I forgot about this last slide. And this one is not as closely related with resource adequacy as the other 3, but it's still an important part. And that is just how the use of our transmission system and how entities rate their equipment. And we've found from previous events that not all utilities rate their stuff the same. And we want to ensure at the MRO and with an industry that ratings are being identified for the operating conditions that we have to operate under. So making sure we have ratings for seasonal and emergency use, and not just limiting, to a static rating that you might assume for a summertime operation in the middle of winter. And I think we are getting some help with that on FERC Order 881. If you're not familiar with that, it's really requiring the industry to use ambient adjusted ratings for kind of year-round operation. And with that, I think, Tasha, my next slide is just going back to our infographic, which I talked about 4 of our top 8 risks. We obviously have another 4, and then on top of that, there's 11 other risks that we've identified in this risk assessment that are working together to inform industry on future actions that we should be taking. With that, I can take any final questions or yield it back to you, Tasha, or Commissioner French.
Are there any questions from KCC staff or CURB or Commissioner Keen? Do you have anything final?
Nothing from Todd Love.
Thank you, Commissioner French. I just simply want to thank Tasha, Brian, and Mark. It's been an excellent presentation. We appreciate your you're taking the time to share your thoughts with us and your indulgence in our questions. Thank you very much.
And
I
thank you.
will- I'll join Commissioner Keen in that thanks. And now I'll turn it back to you, Tasha.
Thank you so much. And in the back of the slide packet, we do have upcoming events. The Regional Risk Assessment webinar is coming up in about a month from today. It looks like on March 8th. And the registration link is in the slides, or if you have any issues, just let me know and I can send it to Jeff. And then the annual reliability conference will be at the MRO offices in St. Paul, Minnesota in May. And you are welcome to attend that as well. And then as previously mentioned, we do have the links to the assessments that we discussed today, plus the MRO website, which has additional information about MRO and our mission. And then contact information for Brian, myself, and Mark if you have any additional questions or if you would like to have future engagements. And we thank you again so much for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you very much, Tasha. It was a great amount of information, and we appreciate you all being a resource to us. I know our staff and CURB will take all of this under advisement and maybe in touch with you with some questions in the future. Let me just pause 1 second to make sure we don't have any additional questions for you before we wrap up the work study session.
I don't have any. I just wanted to say thanks for today. Justin, Leo, any final questions?
Not for me, you guys. Thank you.
All right.
I have nothing to add either. Thank you very much.
Very good. Not hearing anything further, I think we will go ahead and conclude the work study session. Thank you again for presenting to us, and thank you all participants for attending and helping ask questions and get some clarification on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.